The psychological journey of Theon Greyjoy in Game of Thrones is deeply rooted in a lifelong struggle with identity, belonging, and shame. Raised as a hostage in the North after his father's rebellion, Theon grows up at Winterfell among the Starks. Although he is treated relatively well, the psychological implications of being both a ward and a prisoner profoundly shape his sense of self. He exists in a liminal state, not fully a Stark, yet no longer truly Ironborn. This ambiguous position produces a persistent internal tension, where Theon constantly seeks validation and recognition. His need to prove himself becomes the central motivation behind many of his decisions, demonstrating how identity insecurity can drive individuals toward destructive choices in pursuit of acceptance. Theon's return to the Iron Islands marks the beginning of a critical psychological rupture. Hoping to reclaim his place among his people and earn the respect of his father, Balon Greyjoy, he instead encounters rejection and humiliation. The Ironborn see him as softened by the North, while the Starks view him as a subordinate ally rather than a true family member. This rejection reinforces a powerful inferiority complex. From a psychological perspective, Theon begins compensating for perceived weakness through exaggerated displays of aggression and dominance. His decision to betray Robb Stark and seize Winterfell reflects a desperate attempt to assert identity and reclaim agency, illustrating how unresolved shame often manifests as impulsive and morally compromised behavior. The capture of Winterfell represents not only a political betrayal, but also a symbolic attempt by Theon to rewrite his own narrative. Psychologically, he believes that if he can conquer the place that shaped his childhood, he can finally prove his worth. However, this act is fundamentally built upon insecurity rather than genuine conviction. Theon's fragile authority becomes immediately evident as he struggles to maintain control over both the castle and his own followers. The psychological stress of leadership without legitimacy intensifies his paranoia, pushing him toward increasingly cruel decisions, including the execution of innocents to maintain the illusion of strength. This stage of his story reveals how fragile identity structures often require constant reinforcement through external validation. Theon's downfall begins when he is captured by Ramsay Bolton, whose sadistic manipulation dismantles what remains of Theon's identity. Ramsay does not simply torture Theon physically. He systematically destroys his psychological autonomy. By renaming him Reek, Ramsay erases Theon's past and replaces it with a new identity defined by humiliation and submission. This process mirrors real-world psychological conditioning techniques, where repeated trauma and deprivation are used to break a person's sense of self. Theon's transformation into Reek illustrates how identity can be forcibly reconstructed under extreme coercion, creating a fragmented personality driven by fear and survival. The psychological collapse that follows is marked by learned helplessness. After repeated punishment for any attempt at independence, Theon internalizes the belief that resistance is futile. His body language, speech patterns, and emotional responses become shaped entirely by Ramsay's control. This stage demonstrates how prolonged trauma can reshape cognitive processes, leaving victims trapped in cycles of submission even when opportunities for escape arise. Theon's mind becomes a battlefield between the remnants of his former self and the survival mechanism imposed upon him. Despite this collapse, fragments of Theon's original identity continue to exist beneath the imposed persona of Reek. Trauma does not completely erase identity. Rather, it buries it beneath layers of fear and conditioning. Moments of hesitation, guilt, and empathy reveal that the psychological core of Theon still survives. These moments are particularly visible in his interactions with Sansa Stark. Her presence acts as a powerful reminder of the life and relationships he once had, triggering a slow reawakening of his suppressed moral consciousness. The psychological tension between Reek and Theon becomes a central theme during his captivity. Reek represents survival through submission, while Theon represents the buried identity struggling to reemerge. This internal conflict mirrors the psychological process experienced by trauma survivors who attempt to reconcile their past selves with the identities formed under extreme duress. Theon's gradual rediscovery of courage is not sudden heroism, but a slow and painful reclaiming of agency. The act of helping Sansa escape marks the first major fracture in Ramsay's psychological control. Choosing to act despite overwhelming fear signals the return of self-determination. In trauma psychology, reclaiming agency is often the first step in rebuilding identity. Theon's decision is not motivated by confidence, but by guilt and moral responsibility. His willingness to risk punishment reflects the beginning of a transformation where shame becomes a catalyst for redemption rather than paralysis. Guilt plays a crucial psychological role in Theon's transformation. Unlike shame, which attacks the self, guilt focuses on actions and can motivate reparative behavior. Theon's memories of betraying the Starks and harming innocents create a powerful emotional burden that he cannot escape. Rather than destroying him entirely, this guilt becomes the emotional force that pushes him toward acts of sacrifice. His journey demonstrates how individuals can reinterpret past wrongdoing as motivation to pursue moral restoration. By the time Theon begins reclaiming his name, the psychological landscape of his character has fundamentally shifted. Identity is no longer about proving himself to others, but about confronting his own past. The process of saying, "My name is Theon Greyjoy," represents more than a declaration. It symbolizes the reconstruction of a shattered self. This moment reflects a psychological rebirth, in which identity is rebuilt not through dominance or validation, but through acceptance of trauma, guilt, and responsibility. The later stages of Theon Greyjoy's journey explore the psychology of redemption and the transformative power of sacrifice. Redemption in narrative psychology often emerges when characters confront the harm they have caused and actively seek to repair it. For Theon, redemption does not come through grand declarations, but through consistent acts of courage that place others before himself. His actions gradually shift from self-preservation to protection, signaling a profound change in his internal value system. A significant step in this process occurs when Theon reunites with Jon Snow and the surviving Stark family. Instead of seeking forgiveness directly, he demonstrates loyalty through action. This reflects an important psychological concept. Genuine remorse often manifests behaviorally rather than verbally. Theon's willingness to fight alongside those he once betrayed illustrates how moral repair is enacted through consistent ethical behavior rather than the single moment of apology. Theon's relationship with Bran Stark becomes particularly symbolic in understanding the psychology of forgiveness. Bran represents the past that Theon cannot undo, yet Bran's calm acknowledgement of Theon's journey allows him to see himself not solely as a villain, but as someone capable of change. This moment highlights the psychological importance of recognition in the healing process. When individuals believe redemption is possible, they are more likely to pursue morally courageous actions. Sacrifice becomes the ultimate expression of Theon's transformation. Psychologically, sacrifice represents the prioritization of collective well-being over personal survival. For someone whose earlier actions were driven by insecurity and the need for validation, choosing sacrifice demonstrates a complete inversion of motivation. Theon no longer seeks approval or recognition. Instead, he acts according to a moral compass that values the safety of others above his own life. His defense of Bran during the Battle of Winterfell serves as the culmination of this transformation. In this moment, Theon fully embraces the role of protector rather than conqueror. Standing before the Night King and the forces of the dead, he confronts not only an external enemy, but also the symbolic weight of his past failures. The battlefield becomes a psychological stage where his identity as a redeemed individual is tested. The decision to charge toward certain death represents the final integration of Theon's fractured identity. Earlier in the story, he often acted out of fear, pride, or desperation. In this moment, however, his choice is guided by clarity and acceptance. Sacrifice becomes meaningful because it is freely chosen rather than forced. Psychologically, this act represents the restoration of agency that Ramsay once stripped away from him. Another important dimension of this sacrifice is the restoration of belonging. Throughout his life, Theon struggled with the question of where he truly belonged, among the Ironborn or the Starks. By defending Bran and fighting for Winterfell, he resolves this conflict not through lineage but through loyalty and action. Belonging, in this sense, becomes a moral choice rather than a matter of birthright. Theon's arc also demonstrates how narratives of redemption rely on confronting rather than erasing past wrongdoing. His sacrifice does not undo the harm he caused, but it redefines how his life is ultimately remembered. Psychologically, Redemption narratives provide a framework in which individuals can acknowledge guilt while still pursuing moral growth. Theon's story illustrates that redemption is not about becoming innocent again, but about choosing responsibility in the present. The emotional impact of his final moments is amplified by Bran's recognition of him as a good man. This acknowledgement carries immense psychological significance because it validates Theon's struggle for redemption. For someone who spent most of his life searching for approval, this recognition represents the closure of a lifelong identity conflict. It confirms that transformation is possible even after profound moral failure. Ultimately, Theon Greyjoy's journey in Game of Thrones serves as a powerful exploration of trauma, guilt, and sacrifice. His story illustrates how identity can be shattered by shame and violence, yet slowly rebuilt through courage and moral accountability. The psychology of sacrifice in his arc reveals that redemption is not a single act, but a process of confronting one's past, reclaiming agency, and choosing to protect others even at the cost of one's own life.